Thanks for joining us here today for this session, Government as a Partner. So you've got some of our photos and what our titles are there. I'm just going to very briefly introduce folks, Gary, with 2 sentences. I think it's important for context for this panel so we know who we have here. I'm a lawyer by trade, but my portfolio includes government relations. I've worked on the political side of the federal government as well as in-house and private practice. And this is an area, government is an area there that is always rapidly changing, and especially in this particular landscape that we're in, where there's a lot of activity and regulation going on for non-banks. What's going on policy-wise, we always want to have our eye on it. And we want to, as well, make sure that we're always looking at what's going on as a business. We're impacted by it, and a lot of us have varying degrees of activity in this area. So we've got 3 different perspectives today from 3 dynamic folks who are going to speak with us. So Darren Thomas is the provincial regulator, so he's the Director of Fair Trading as delegated with Service Alberta. He's responsible for regulations relating to employment agencies and recruitment, cost of credit disclosure, high cost credit, collections and debt repayment, credit reporting, payday lending, and timeshares. So a lot of you have probably dealt with him and or his colleagues, given that the space that we're in. Jess Weiser is here as well. He's Vice President Government Relations at Equifax, where he leads the Canadian GR team's federal and provincial engagement. And before joining Equifax, he served as a senior political aide to various cabinet ministers in the Canadian federal government. And Bonnie Murray is with us as well. She's a partner in financial services regulatory group at Blake's. She provides regulatory advice to Canadian and foreign financial institutions and service providers on all aspects of business, and has a significant experience liaising with federal and provincial regulators on behalf of clients on regulatory approval applications, compliance issues, and questions of statutory interpretation. So I think all of these 3 folks have great insights to share with us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite each of them to make some opening comments on the theme of government as a partner, and then we'll follow up with some questions. And I'm sure that some of you will have questions, and we are lucky enough to be the last session before your coffee break, so you can certainly find any of us afterwards if you have additional questions. So I'm going to first invite Darren to make comments related to government as a partner from a regulator's point of view. So please go ahead, Darren.
So good morning. I am, for the record, a statute administrator, not the president of the Government of Alberta. So I'm here as an individual speaking sort of on the operational side of the regulatory framework, and I'm currently wondering about the wisdom of accepting that, given that we're that giant, well, tiny red bar over on the side of the first presentation we had this morning. From an operational regulatory perspective, I think one of the things that the folks in this room need to keep in mind is that there are really 2 types of government relations. There's the operational piece, that statute side, the enforcement side, which is where I sit, and then there's the political side. And they're related, and you need to understand that both of those have value for you. Having a conversation with just one side isn't necessarily going to help you. If you reach out on the political side, as soon as you're done that meeting, a request for a briefing note comes down to the folks on my side saying, tell me what's going on here. If you're only talking to me and there's potential legislative changes going out and being considered, you're going to find that you're missing the boat on that side. Once it reaches that sort of formal consultation piece, I'm going to tell you, government rarely asks questions formally that it doesn't already have a pretty good idea of what the answer is going to be. So that informal side on both the political and the informal side on the regulatory is really where you want to have that initial conversation. And reach out when you have questions, reach out as an industry. I can't stress that industry side enough. Groups like this offer a huge amount of value for government. When individual companies reach out with questions on the legislation or to introduce themselves, there's a great deal of value for that. One of the things folks in industry don't often realize is just how little data and how little information government typically has with respect to the industries that we regulate. there's not a lot of resources devoted on the government side as a general rule to understanding the marketplace. I'm responsible for a whole whack of legislation. The information that we have on those individual marketplaces, particularly where there are changes happening, is very limited. We keep our fingers as best we can on the pulse of it. Opportunities like this are always a good one for us. But at the end of the day, when the questions come down, the answers we're giving are usually a couple of years behind where industry is. So having the opportunity to sit down with industry, having industry folks reach out and provide us with some of that information, and I'd recommend you don't cherry pick. We're usually able to pick out when folks are trying to snow job us. Provide us with information that's valuable for where the industry is going, and you're going to find that the regulations and the policies that come into effect are a lot closer to what you want than you'd expect as a general rule. That's not always true. There's political changes, there's staff changes that can impact the outreach you've done. But if you're having those conversations with the regulators and you're keeping them up to date on what's happening in the industry, and if you're having those conversations on the political side where you think that you've got a target point to make, where you've got an idea of what it is that you're going into the room to get, it makes your life easier and it makes my life a lot easier. I always tell my licensees, I'd much rather talk to people before something goes wrong than after, because it makes my life a lot easier to deal with things before something blows up. The last thing anyone in government, whether on the political side or the regulatory side, is to be on, marketplace or W5. We're very risk averse, and where we don't know what those risks are, that's where you see some of those regulatory pieces coming in that you're not looking for. So again, have those conversations and give us the information we need to make good decisions, and things will go much more smoothly for you and for us.
Excellent, thank you for that. So I'm going to turn it over to Jess now, who's going to speak about effective engagement with political stakeholders.
Super. Good morning, folks. I'm going to try to cover quickly two topics with my time. One is just that effective engagement with political stakeholders, and two, I'd like to give a bit of a bird's eye view of those policy files that we see coming down the political horizon that are certainly important to us and that I suspect are probably pretty meaningful to the folks in this room as well. In terms of effective engagement with political stakeholders, I'm gonna also quickly go over some definitions, some qualification, which I think Darren touched on. When I talk about political stakeholders, what I mean are exclusively those folks who are elected officials in the federal or provincial legislatures, potentially also appointed to the federal or provincial cabinets, and their politically appointed staffs. So those people whose jobs depend on elections, and not those people whose jobs are, generally speaking, maintained independent of elections, i.e. the formal, professional, civil servant class, okay? So how do we engage politicians and their staffs effectively? You gotta think about those things that motivate them and not necessarily those things that motivate you. I'd say two big things. I'll start with number one. You want to identify and describe why they should care about you first. Not necessarily your issue or your ask, but why they should care about you. So who are you? Your company, your industry, your profession. They all think about you in terms of what is your influence, what is your reach, what is your impact. So you should be thinking about those things as well. Another helpful item in terms of their motivators and identifying and describing yourselves, what kind of economic impact does your company or your industry or your profession have? Think about that broadly. Direct jobs, your own employees, indirect jobs that your company or your industry provides in the marketplace, the taxes you pay as an employer, the taxes that your employees pay, other economic positive spin-offs, whether they're regional or not. that occur as a result of who you're describing yourself as. Also your societal impact, not just your economic impact, but in addition to your economic impact, or perhaps despite it, is there some societal or public good that you are providing? Are you providing access to responsible lending that a certain segment of the population would not otherwise receive, independent and despite whatever economic impact you're providing? That is the way they will understand whether you are meaningful or whether or not you are meaningful. Another piece there, importantly, make sure that work is done ahead of describing and identifying what your ask or what your issue is. Likely weeks and months ahead of time, identifying thoughtfully who you are and why you're important to the people who you're going to approach. At minimum, if you have to, if you're submitting a letter, if you're going into a meeting and you haven't explained those things, at least do it at the outset. Do it at the beginning of the meeting, or do it at the top of the letter. The other thing to think about, often we're talking about smaller companies or relatively small and medium-sized companies, and it may be difficult to describe your impact specifically from within the parameters of your organization. Like I said, use your industry, use your profession, use a collection of organizations like you, or apropos to where we are today, use an industry association like the Canadian Lenders Association. You can think of the arguments that an association could provide about, hey, the collective or the associated groups or companies within our organization has a loan book of X many millions or billions of dollars. The associated groups within our association provided responsible lending to X many Canadians or Ontarians or British Columbians that would have otherwise not had access to it. So that's how you create for the meaning for yourself and relevance to then move on to your topic, your issue, your ask, whatever that may be. I'm going to repeat the same thing in terms of your ask and your issue. Think about their motivators, not just yours. It's not just about we have an innovative solution or there's some government barrier to us providing some solution that the marketplace needs. It's what is the economic impact? What is the societal impact of my issue and my ask? And you don't need to spell it out from them, but oftentimes if your issue has a large enough or meaningful enough economic or social impact, they will also understand that there's a political and electoral impact to that ask or that issue. The last thing I'm going to talk about in terms of successfully engaging and influencing the political level, I'm going to piggyback a bit on Darren's role and what Darren's talked about. Make sure when you talk about your issue and your ask, you've already completed those discussions, those same discussions with the professional civil service level, and you're ready to communicate to the political level the status or the outcome of those discussions, whether they are, hey, there's disagreement with the civil servant level, or there's not disagreement per se, but we're told that the idea is a non-starter because it's outside of current policy authority or outside of current legislative or regulatory authorities. And if they ever are going to do anything, there needs to be a change made to regulation or legislation. I'm going to move on quickly if I have 30 seconds just to talk about, before we get into Q's and A's, 4 policy items that we see coming down or that are on the political horizon, important to us and we think meaningful to everyone here. Number 1, and I'm going to use categories here because there's too many individual items, but I'll call it new regulations and laws federally and provincially on data-driven technology. For us, that means algorithms. That means artificial intelligence. I'm sure it means the same thing for many of you, but some other topics as well. We will see, in my view, an influx of rules, proposals around such rules on data-driven technology, number 1. Number 2, privacy. That's not a surprise, but we are going to see attempts at significant privacy law overhauls at both the federal and provincial levels. That will be complicated for business. These things will be happening in tandem, and you shouldn't assume that provincial governments are going to cooperate with the federal government or vice versa. Each are going to be racing to bring in what they perceive and what they'll be able to communicate as better privacy rules, offering more protection for consumers, specifically around consumer rights to data, to their own data, things like accessing, sharing, and erasing their own data. Third item, but tied to that, is open banking. Won't get into it, I know we have limited time, but perhaps in the Q&A. And the last item, most relevant to us, but I think with impacts by extension to all of you, is new credit reporting laws or amendments to existing credit reporting laws in all of the provinces that will have an impact on the way that lenders can or can't access credit reports and credit file data from credit reporting agencies.
Thank you, Jess. That was a lot of great information.
Right.
So Bonnie is going to speak with us now about tips for dealing with regulators and how to address business challenges.
Thanks. And we do want to have some Q&A, so just let me take a few minutes, good morning, and say that really we've had a lot, and Jess, that was lots of good stuff from the policy side, and as Darren said, really you think of it, there's a operational regulatory side of things and then this policy side of things. So I normally am dealing with the operational regulatory side of things. And I'll just take a few minutes to share with you, government as your partner, really, as if any of you in the room are at a regulated entity, you know that it's in your best interest to stay on the right side of our regulators. And part of that is conducting yourselves accordingly and not triggering investigations, but also every time you deal with a regulator, I think it's helpful to think about, as Darren just gave us some insight into where they're coming from, and realizing that it's helpful to, I think, tailor your approach to different regulators for different reasons to understand their mandate and their own challenges. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of that briefly. At the federal level, I think there are some, but not tons of federally regulated institutions in the room, but OSFI, as we know, is the banking regulator. Even OSFI, STAC, FinTrack, these are all the federal regulators. We know that they're completely backlogged, they're moving so slowly. The federal election slows them down as well, but even before that, OSFI is just, the turnaround times are much slower. But one thing I don't think we realize is they have a challenge in sort of retaining, getting in not good people, but people who have industry expertise. Like Darren was saying, it's a struggle internally at the government to get industry expertise, because the people who have the expertise are in this room, they're in industry, they probably don't live in Ottawa, they don't want to move to Ottawa and work for a regulator. And there's pretty high turnover. So they're struggling to understand the questions, understand the applications they're getting, and anything you can do to help, I think they appreciate. So when we do applications, not only are we very careful to follow their instructions and point out to them exactly, what they've asked for, address all their issues, but also to give them a little bit of help along the way. Not education exactly, but just making sure they understand where things fit in, and I think that goes a long way. Provincially, it's quite different, actually. I feel like I've been dealing with the same people in the same provinces for years, which is great because they know their processes and their legislation inside out, like if you're dealing with licensing issues at a provincial regulator. And they're, in my experience, very cooperative as long as you give them a heads up, you give them notice of things in time to do things. The problem is we're so often going to these departments and asking for things quickly or after the fact, and we're rushing and we're cleaning up messes. And they're doing their best, but they have limited resources. Obviously, some of the bigger provinces have bigger, more sophisticated regulatory bodies, but in lots of the provinces, we're just dealing with a division of the Department of Finance or Consumer Affairs. And they have maybe only a few people, someone's on vacation, that really impacts their ability to respond, to deal with things quickly. And I think if we just keep all these things in mind in dealing with them, you'll just maintain a good relationship.
Excellent. Thank you all for your comments. Very valuable insight. So I have a few questions here. We'll see how far we get. So for folks in our audience who perhaps are in smaller or medium-sized businesses that don't have a dedicated individual who works on government relations, and there are many people who are dealing with the tasks kind of on the side of their desk, and smaller companies who may be scared of getting on the radar, what is your best advice for a company who has no relationship with government to start building one, and to balance that issue of being too scared to raise an issue because they're worried about additional scrutiny? Whoever wants to take the question, please.
Sure. I'll start on the political side. I may end up echoing a little bit of what I said, but create the relationship, but the precursor to doing that is identifying what you're going to communicate and how you're going to create the rapport, what you want them to know about you, particularly perhaps at the political level. The people with whom you're dealing are going to be generalists in anything and everything. They're there because of politics and typically not because of some specific expertise or experience in credit reporting or payday lending or those things that Darren will have developed expertise and knowledge in. Go back to those motivators. What's important to them? Find out what's meaningful to you and create them to the point of, this is a cost-heavy exercise, sometimes an effort-heavy exercise. Find those groups with similar asks or which are similar to yourselves, quite frankly, in terms of what you provide and what you do in the market, and pool resources with them, whether that's through a formal industry association or some kind of ad hoc collective of groups who can pool resources.
I would add, so if you're a person at a small business and it's like, oh, now my job is government relations, what do I do? I think one thing you can do, maybe you're a member of an organization like this, maybe that's not a possibility for your organization at the moment. I think that first thing is you can sign up to alerts from government websites, and so most of the regulators or their websites will send out alerts, and so you just, first of all, you get on top of the current state of play, start figuring out, okay, what's changing, and it doesn't take that long to get up to speed on that thing. Law firms send out bulletins all the time, you can subscribe to these things, and so then you at least have a flow coming in and you figure out, okay, what's useful to my business, what isn't useful, and you narrow that down. And then I think when you start getting those alerts, you realize consultations will be happening, there'll be opportunity to comment on things. Yes, you don't want to necessarily tell the regulator everything all the time, but you might want to, don't be afraid, I think, to be a little bit open. Like in Canada, we do have generally principles-based collaborative regulation compared to the US. Sometimes our US friends are very nervous about talking to regulators. It's a very different environment there. And so in my experience, I think it's not quite as risky to just sort of make those, reach out and have those conversations.
So to echo that, there's really two ways to get on my radar. The first is voluntarily, the second is involuntarily. The second way is way worse for you. If you've reached out, if you've shown you're doing your due diligence, if you can show that you've had some phone conversations, it doesn't necessarily mean fly to Edmonton and have coffee with me. But if you've got questions about interpretation of the legislation, if you've got concerns with the legislation and how it works, if you've reached out and had those conversations and something does come up, you've built up some goodwill and some credit that will go a long way when it comes to resolving it in a way that's less adversarial for you. My goal is not to issue fines to everyone. My goal is to make sure there's compliance with the legislation. And if I can do that without having to go down those paths, it simplifies my life. Again, I'm mostly worried about how much time I have to spend with each of my regulations. I've got lots of stuff on my desk. If you've done that outreach, if I know who you are and it's in a positive framework, it's going to solve things that much more easily if it comes to a negative framework. For example, when we were doing our high-cost credit piece and we were looking at implementing it, I reached out to a number of the organizations that we'd had contact with prior to that had proactively come to the government that said, hey, this is who we are, this is some of our numbers. Having those contacts so that I could reach out and say, this is what we're looking at doing with respect to our standards and our compliance guidelines was hugely valuable for me. And it also meant that what we ended up putting together, it might not have been exactly what industry was looking for or what some of the lenders would have liked, but it was a lot closer than if I'd just put things together on my own. So having that relationship and that ability to do that outreach for me creates some real value, and it means that the industry folks have less risk on the table, even if something does go wrong down the line.
So just following up on that involuntary thread that you were talking about, how would one go about repairing a relationship with a regulator after there's been an investigation, an issue, a fine, there's been something very negative, it's been resolved, but how do you reset and get things back on the right side again?
Ideally, you shouldn't have to reset, assuming that the breaches, the contraventions that you're dealing with aren't ones that are egregious and intentional. Mistakes happen. Most regulators recognize that. Just because you've been found in contravention and there's been an order or an administrative penalty issued doesn't mean that you're in anyone's bad books. I wouldn't worry about, don't sweat the small stuff. Now, if you've been caught out and there's a couple $1 million worth of money that you shouldn't have held on to, and you did it intentionally, well, you're probably not going to continue operating in that province. I mean, quite frankly, if there's a licensing requirement or other pieces like that. So, but again, it comes to building that goodwill, showing you're doing your due diligence, and if the regulator's aware of that, the contraventions occur. We're not there to shut good businesses down. Good businesses make mistakes. If the problem has been addressed, it's not something where you should have to repair that piece. Where you might have to think about what you're doing is if you've had 3 or 4 of those, the regulator's going to start wondering. And those are the situations, again, where those longer term pieces are going to come in, where you're doing the work and doing the outreach and showing the due diligence.
I don't know if we have time for one more question. We're getting close. Okay, 2 minutes, so we'll be quick. How does a company navigate the waters when we're dealing with changing political climates and also regional political differences and policy differences? So we talked about the high cost credit regulations, which are in some provinces but not in others yet. And you may be working on an issue where you've worked on it for quite some time, and then there's a change of government. And now the issue that was pressing and burning no longer is. So any tips, quick tips, for Gary's 2 minutes, that you can pass along here to folks operating in this space?
Sure. I mean, it's going to sound like an echo, but I'll reiterate some of my points earlier. The benefits of that early work of defining who you are in the context of, at least at the political level, political stakeholders, that is that much more important, because you'll have to return to step 1, move away from all of the work you've done on particular issues in the case of the political side, and return to who we are, what we do, what is our value and contribution to the economy, to consumers, to this region, to society.
Hire a good lawyer. And it's really the same thing I said before, which is if you get up to speed on where things are at, it's much easier to stay on top of them, and then just look at alerts and look at bulletins and look at things that come out. And organizations like this, law firms do seminars when there's a big shift in regulatory landscape, things like that. So I would look out for those things.
Really, this is a question for him. From the regulatory perspective, good policy is generally good policy. The data is what it is. The other pieces there, the flavor pieces, that's on the political side for the most part. Once the legislation's in place, it's our job to enforce it, regardless of sort of what's going on with that sort of broader political side.
Excellent. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. And that is our time. So I'll pass things back over to Gary.